So hello everyone. Actually there are very few occasions where as a reporter you come across a piece of work which changes your life and the way you think. These are wonderful moments, and I have recently experienced one which I want to share with you. It's life-changing in the sense that it's both worrying, desperately worrying, as well as a signal that something major needs to be done in India. And it's crucial for each one of us to be part of the change that's needed. I'm talking about this book. It's really, honestly, one of the finest and most important books I have read. It's about corruption in India's healthcare and medical system. And as the title says, it asks the question, are our doctors healers or are they predators? It's a book written by doctors about this crisis in India. Sorry, I would say the many different crises, because it's a huge book with many, many wonderful authors and, dare I say, well edited. These are crises that we as ordinary patients face every single day. And often we don't even know that it's a crisis. And while we have always trusted our doctors, this trust is now beginning to break down, as this book confirms that every aspect of medical care in India is riddled with corruption. Yes, it's a brilliant book, and it's both depressing and an eye-opener. And as a result of reading this book, all of us at NDTV have decided to launch a campaign over the next 12 months to work towards exposing corruption and try and help change, in any way we can, the healthcare system in India. As I hope you'll all be part of that change. As Sonia Sotomayor says, we are here not to fight the system, but to fix it. So if you want to be part of the change, it's really worth reading this book and joining, please, the NDTV campaign. We shall be looking at different aspects of the entire issue. Firstly, how bad is medical corruption in India? How many of us are aware? And it's all beautifully explained in this book. Now, what is the impact of this corruption? Is it purely financial, that we are paying 10% more, 20% more? Or is it much more direct? Does it impact all our lives? And indeed it does. And we'll be hearing how it impacts our lives. It's not just a cop taking 100 rupees fine. We shall also look at why is there corruption in healthcare in India? What are the main causes? Why is it so much more? According to this book, it's the second most corrupt sector in India, healthcare. We shall penultimately look at where does this corruption exist? Is it only in India, or is it across the world? Is it global? And if it is global, does that excuse us? Because we've heard that famous saying, oh, don't worry about corruption, it's a global phenomenon. But that doesn't exonerate us. And finally, we'll be asking each of the panelists to look at solutions, give us solutions. What can be done? To discuss all this, we have Salman Khurshid. He's former minister, of course, and has got a very strong academic background. He's, of course, very strong in law and has fought many cases in the Supreme Court on healthcare and healthcare corruption. We have Rima Nagarajan, I would say one of the finest journalists in India today, who writes extensively and with great depth and knowledge about the crisis in our healthcare system and the corruption. And it's just wonderful to have her here. I tried to convince her to anchor this. It would have been much better, but journalists are lazy. Then we have Vinod Paul, a very well-known pediatrician, student of yours, and is terrified of Dr. Nandi, like we all are. And in fact, was the top student or gold medalist at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. All thanks to Dr. Nandi. Right? The favorite teacher, that's what you say in front of him. And he's in charge, he's at Niti Aayog, in charge of this new, hugely ambitious and wonderful idea of health insurance for 500 million people in India. And we'll be asking him, is that a solution and how will it be implemented? It's a great idea. Many states have already done it. How can we improve, because they're facing a lot of problems? So that's a very important part of the discussion today. Then we've got David Berger. He's possibly, actually he is, Shomran, the reason why there's now this focus on corruption in healthcare. He started it all. He was working in a small hospital in Landau in Missouri, and he came across this issue and then wrote about corruption in Indian the healthcare system in the British Medical Journal, and it just took off after that. And he's written about other countries as well. And in this book, he writes about corruption in many other Western countries. I hope that doesn't mean that it's fine for us to be corrupt. Not really. Okay. And Dr. Nandi, one of the three editors of the book, Dr. Nandi is a guitarist and a singer, and
my claim to fame.
His main claim to fame, and fortunately he's forgotten his guitar today. He also happens to be probably the only FRCP and FRCS in India. Both. That's no joke. And we have the two co-editors with us. Kesav Desiraju. He's, of course, the former health secretary. And so would you just stand up? Yeah. It's wonderful to have you here, sir. I know you try and live down the fact that you were a government servant, but we are proud of you, because he was a person who tried to clean up the system, tried to clean up the Medical Council of India, and because he tried, he was shunted out. And that's a lesson in itself. And then we have, of course, Sanjay Nagral, a surgeon at Jaslok Hospital in Bombay. Thank you, Sanjay. And he's a prolific author and a surgeon, and he's the publisher of the Indian Journal of Medical Ethics. Thank you very much for coming all the way from Bombay. Well, as I said, we're going into 4 or 5 sections, so I'd like to start with the first one. Now, there are many doctors in the audience, Vilma, if I can start with you, who are aware of the corruption and the internal issues. But the average person is not, they've heard of corruption. How bad is it really? Give us some examples of corruption. Quick 2-3 examples.
If you were to go to buy any medicine, there's a huge margin on all of them. So what medicine you are prescribed by your doctor would depend on what kind of margin there is in it for the doctor, for the hospital, for the pharma companies. So that's corruption for you.
One of the points you've written in your article, that a medicine worth 800 rupees is sometimes sold at 15,000?
Yes, 800 to 15,000, that's just the medicine. I think everybody will also be familiar with stents, which has been talked about a lot. A stent which is imported into this country for 25,000, which was being sold for 1.5 to 2 lakh. So there are those kind of margins also that we are talking about. And who are the people who benefit from those margins? From everyone, from doctors to the traders, to the companies which are manufacturing those stents. Then there is the diagnostics companies, the labs. Do you really need all those tests that you are being prescribed? Did you really need that surgery that you were asked to go through?
What happens that the person who recommends you go to the lab gets a kickback from the lab? Or the person that recommends you to get...
Well, the person who recommends tests is usually the doctor. Yeah. And I think your television channel has done a whole program on how doctors were getting cuts from diagnostic labs for the tests that were written for, and often the doctor will tell you specifically which lab to go to, because those are the labs which are going to give the doctor the cut. So this corruption again is not just about how much margins are being made or how much money is being taken from you. It's also about your health in terms of did you really need the medicine that you're being prescribed? Do you really need the surgery that you're being asked to undergo? Did you really need 3 stents when you actually needed perhaps only 1? But you're being asked to go in for 3 stents because somebody is getting a cut out of that. So it's also about how much it affects your health. It's not just about
financial.
Money. No, it's not just financial. There are implications for the health of the people.
Right. Shomiron, there's a couple of things I'm really fascinated with, and that is what's called a sink test and a fridge X-ray. What are these?
Here, the sink test is that you send a blood sample to the lab, and they take the blood sample and throw it down the sink. And then they give a report which is detailed on the hemoglobin, white count, blood urea, creatinine, all cooked up in the technician's mind. And when I was a student, when I was an assistant professor at the All India Institute, the chairman of radiology told me that there was a standard way of getting, where do the chest x-rays from the All India Institute disappear? She said that you go to Bihar, you go to a small little place, and the person is told to stand in front of a screen, and a fridge door is opened and banged hard. And then they're given this All India Institute X-ray. And this is the way that the fridge works, and it's very effective.
Dr. Berger, one of the things that's been highlighted, actually really startling in this book, is that medical colleges, we have the most medical colleges in India, mostly private, I think 472 medical colleges, mostly owned by politicians. And many of them, if not most, don't have any faculty, but they are audited. And before the auditor flies in, they fly in a whole faculty that stays there for 48 hours, says hello to the auditor, checks, they even put in some patients, dummy patients. The auditor sees the faculty which has just been flown in, and after the auditor goes, all the faculty goes away. So with that kind of medical education, it's frightening. It's not just a financial issue. You go to a doctor, he's really not a doctor.
Yeah, and I think that's the key. As you said earlier, it's not just having to give 100 rupees to a traffic policeman. This is something that we can all relate to as patients. All we doctors are also going to be patients one day. And the thing that actually prompted me to write an article in the first place was that I was just so very struck by the lack of trust in the doctor-patient relationship. And if you can't trust your doctor not to be corrupt, if you believe that perhaps your doctor is sending you for an investigation, potentially an invasive investigation that can have side effects, or sending you for an unnecessary treatment like an operation, or that they may not actually be competent, then that strikes at the very heart of the healing relationship and really destroys the healing relationship. So, at a time when 25% of rural bankruptcies in India are thought to be for medical bills, and you can't even be sure that those medical bills were even necessary, it's easy to see how there's a crisis in confidence that strikes at the very heart of the medical system and that totally defeats the whole point of what we're trying to do as doctors and what we went to medical school for.
Right. Medical school, Salman Khurshid, you know about the terrible reputation, in fact more than reputation, established facts about the Medical Council of India being totally corrupt, and they're the people who give recognition to medical colleges, and they take huge amounts of money for that. How does one stop that? Because I don't want to make this a political thing, but politicians shunt out people who try to clean up the system. How does one make the Medical Council of India honest if the politicians at the top are not honest?
Well, I submit that you begin where the root cause is. The root cause is politicians. Please do something about them. I mean, I'm quite happy to say that.
But tell us a bit about this recognition part.
But the problem about recognition, every year the Supreme Court gets hundreds of cases. So they've gone through the High Court and they come to the Supreme Court. And till the last bell rings, as it were, for the schedule of giving clearances, people are coming to the Supreme Court, coming back to the Supreme Court, etc. And there are questions raised all the time. Why did the Supreme Court intervene so late? Why did the Supreme Court say no here? Why did they say yes there? And each case that comes to the courts is startling by itself. There are people who are refused, of course, in some cases, as you've said, because they have fake faculty come in and just sign. But there are people who are refused permission. They've got everything. They've got entire infrastructure. And then they are asked that some of your doctors should go and spend nights in various villages and work there. And then next morning at 11 o'clock, the MCI team arrives and says, 6 of your doctors are not here because those poor people have been in the villages and they've just come back and are getting ready. And so because they're not there at 11 o'clock, they're not given permission to start their course.
So
now,
what kind of doctors are we training at these courses?
Well, I think there's a real problem. There's a problem about honest people who fall prey to the bureaucracy that will not look at something where you have to be flexible. If you've sent 40 doctors away for 2 nights to work in villages, and if they're not there at 11, I mean, they could be there at 12. You should be happy that they're at 12 with whatever reprimand, etc. But force them to go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court cancelling whatever bank guarantees have been given because there is a technical flaw, and they say, well, you haven't met these.
That's the point you're making, that the honest are getting punished.
The honest are punished, and the not so honest manage to get through.
The crisis is the kind of doctors we're getting. Dr. Paul, one of the issues wanted to focus on is that in this kind of a system, the rich tend to get away with it, although our system is pretty good that everybody is included. Whether rich or poor, you get affected by corruption, your health gets affected, your family's health gets affected. But in reality, it's the poor that's hit the most by corruption. Explain that to us.
Well, I do agree that in an environment where integrity violations happen, and health sector is particularly prone to this is a well-known fact. The brunt is borne by the poor and the most vulnerable. But before we go any further, Pranay, I'd like to say that 2 things. One, that this book is about corruption, but it doesn't mean everybody is corrupt. And the medical profession cannot be painted in one color. Just that extreme
that's a valid
view.
point.
That's a point.
I think
that
it
must be
mentions
made.
in the book about 50 to 70% of doctors are corrupt, but not everyone. Only 50 to 70%.
No, but I think that's an extreme issue. So,
50, neck and neck.
So the medical profession and the health sector is not uniform.
It's a valid point, yes.
Corrupt. That's a very important part. And secondly, I also think that the editors have used a very strong word of predators, healers or predators. It's just 2 extremes. Because a predator is a very strong word. A person who ruthlessly exploits others is the dictionary meaning. I wish it was a bit softer to be in the middle ground and be balanced, something like healers or profiteer or something. I must say that on behalf of the medical profession and health sector person, a little moderation and balance is required. Having said that, it is true that according to a study by Transparency International, that in India, around 50% people believe that the health system is corrupt or very corrupt. And this happens to be higher than the global average if you look at how people perceive the health system in other countries. That point is well taken. And on the issue of, let's say, fraud in the health system, 6% of global resources go to fraud of the health spending, total health spending, 6 to 8% is actually lost to fraud in a way in economic terms. The point that you're making regarding
I should just
the
put that in
brunt that is
context.
borne by the poor is
The
indeed
context
true.
is 6% globally. In India, the estimate according to this book is 25% of money is lost. It's not only expensive, it's money down the drain. You see suicides, you see people dying unnecessarily. So it's not just a question of the impact goes more than just financial, isn't that?
Well, absolutely, and I think I'd have to take issue, and I think predators is the right word. And we're talking about situations such as where women in Andhra Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, Gujarat found themselves prey to entirely unscrupulous gynecologists who could only be termed predators when some baseline below poverty line insurance came in, up to 30,000 rupees a year for the poorest of the poor, and they found that all of a sudden their gynecological complaints ended in an absolute need for a hysterectomy, which surprisingly enough cost 30,000 rupees. So of course hysterectomy rates shot up, and some of them weren't even hysterectomies, they were just open-close abdominal operations without even taking the uterus out. So when you're looking at situations like that with unnecessary surgeries, it is undoubtedly the case that there are predators out there, and I think that point needs to be made.
Right, Shomiran, I can ask you, why did you call it predators? I mean,
I think predator is someone who looks for prey and catches the prey and then eats it. And, and we have, I asked my residents, what percentage of doctors do you think are honest? And most of them said 70 to 80%. But interestingly, I went to KM Hospital in Bombay, and I was doing an exam there. Not me, I was taking the exam. And we were discussing corruption in Bombay. And they were telling me that 90% of general practitioners in Bombay get kickbacks from consultants to whom they refer patients. So I asked one of the very eminent physician in Bombay, Dr. Hiralal Desai, the late Dr. Hiralal Desai. Is it true that 90% of doctors in Bombay give kickbacks? He said that's an incorrect figure. It's 99%. So I think that unfortunately, one of the reasons why we haven't done anything about corruption is we've accepted it. And it's only when the great David Berger wrote this piece in the BMJ that we all woke up and said something should be done.
so Shomiran, the kind of things you've listed here, medical college problems, capitation fees, so when they become doctors they already have a huge debt, and you've written about it also, Rima. You've written about those cuts for referrals, you've written about doing unnecessary investigations, which you just talked about, performing unnecessary procedures, giving somebody a stent or doing a cesarean when they don't need it. And you also mentioned that in 5-star hospitals, doctors are paid so much and they have to justify their salary. So they have to do a whole lot of tests where the 5-star hospital gets money for those tests, and that justifies their huge salaries. Then there's something called facilitation charges you talk about, and that's in the private sector, but in the public sector, Rima, there's also, you have to pay to get a good posting or to get a promotion. So it's not just a private sector thing, it's both private and public, is that right?
Yes, and it's not just about their promotions. It's also that when you have a really strong private sector, there are also cases of public sector doctors being paid off to do referrals. Especially you have cases of public sector companies like Coal India and several of these companies. You have doctors in their small little hospitals which are attached to the industries, and those doctors are get really heavy kickbacks because Coal India and most of the PSUs have almost like a blank check as to how much you can spend on your health.
How about the two authors, Kesav Desiraju? Could you say just a few words about...
Since you asked me, I think one issue that all of us who are concerned about healthcare, not necessarily just the corruption issues, is that there's a terrible crisis of qualified health professionals in the public service. And not just nurses, not just doctors, but nurses, nurse practitioners, allied health professionals, super specialists. Somebody just mentioned we have some 60,000 MBBS seats every year, some 29,000 postgraduate seats every year. These people are not coming to work in the public system, or very few of them are. And we have committed ourselves to universal healthcare. We have committed ourselves to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. We are not going to get there unless our health facilities are adequately staffed at all levels. And much of the corruption is to do with the fact that we don't have the staff where we need them. And the few people there are so highly prized and so highly valued that their services are available at a premium. Governments are not talking about this. State governments are not putting money into medical education. Tamil Nadu is a state that has done so, but UP has not. All of UP has something like 10 government medical colleges. This is a non-working situation. We are just allowing private medical education, private nursing education, and the whole allied health is private. Now, unless state governments take the lead in setting up institutions of health education, we have terrible problems there.
I think the book mentions that government is spending 1% of GDP, while China is 3%, 1.02, yeah. So one factual question I would like to ask you as a co-editor, how many emails did this editor write to you during the course of this book?
About 3,000.
3,000?
Can I just come in just and expand on what Keshav said? It's absolutely imperative for healthcare in any country, let alone a country like India, that there is a robust, widespread system of primary healthcare. In practice, as has already been alluded to, vast amounts of healthcare are delivered here by people who are completely unqualified. Training them up is one solution. It's a relatively short-term solution. The absolute key for India is to follow countries like Thailand, and I have to say China, and to implement widespread primary healthcare in the rural areas, and that can only be done if doctors are coming out of medical school and they are not indebted up to their eyeballs.
So primary healthcare in Thailand is...
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, there's universal healthcare in Thailand, a good system of primary healthcare. It's the absolute key. And I often tell my students and junior doctors that one of the key roles of the general practitioner, the primary healthcare practitioner, the family practitioner, is to protect their patients from the negative effects of secondary healthcare. The primary health practitioner is the patient's advocate in a very scary, dangerous world. And in India, there just aren't enough of them, and there hasn't been an institutional drive to put that layer in.
As a part of Ayushman Bharat mission
Yep.
of the Prime Minister, this very deficit in our health system is being addressed. The current primary healthcare system of India focused largely on maternal, reproductive and child health, and a few communicable diseases will be now enlarged. And we're going to build 150,000 health and wellness centers with public health action by upgrading the sub-centers. So the direction is right, and we are educated by the Thai system. And at that level, the doctors, more than the doctors, it is the mid-level providers and the nurse practitioner that have a role.
Going on to this, just moving on to the why is it so bad in the medical sector? It's the second worst, apart from the police, according to Transparency International, most corrupt sector in India. Why? Why medicine? What are the, say, 3 reasons why it's worse than, well, I don't know if it's worse than media, but that needs to be studied.
I think, any sector which has a lot of public dealing, the chances are that there is greater perception among the public that it's corrupt. But having said that, Yes, police is considered to be corrupt because you deal with the police almost on an everyday basis, like at traffic intersections, you see them all the time. In the same way, there is somebody that all of us know in our family who has had something to do with the health system. And most of those experiences also include a component of corruption.
But one of the things you mentioned in your article, as well as Amartya Sen, is the asymmetry of information. That seems very important.
Well, asymmetry, yes, because you don't know if you really need that test, or you don't know if you really have the disease that the doctor is telling you. So there is a huge asymmetry of information.
But if you've gone through a red light, you know you've gone through a red light.
Yes, exactly.
So there's equal information.
Yeah.
But if you've got an illness, you don't know. The doctor knows everything, you know zero.
And also, in a place like India, for example, where more than 80% of us are paying for healthcare from our own pockets, and we don't have any kind of public healthcare. I am going in as an individual and I have zero negotiating power. So I'm vulnerable all the more to being gypped by the system. Because there is
and also you're going in a very crisis situation.
Yes, I'm in distress. Death. It's not like, often people say that healthcare is like any consumer goods or commodity. It is not. I can decide not to buy a car because it's too expensive. I can decide I want to buy a scooter. But if I have cancer, I can't decide that I'm not going to go in for treatment. Or if I have a heart attack and I'm rushed to the hospital, I don't have a choice but to go in for the treatment. So it's completely different. It cannot be treated like any other commodity. And that's the reason why, it's so vulnerable to corruption.
So this aspect where doctors know they have information, the patient has no alternative. So they have to accept everything.
Yeah, I think the relationship still between a doctor and a patient, and I see patients every day, and basically they look at the doctor as God or next to God, and it is very rare that they will ever question something that the doctor does. This is India, whereas in the US, I think it's a much more equal relationship. Here, it is much more paternalistic. The doctor's up there, and I tell my patients, I know what is good for you, and this is what you should do. I mean, if you tell a patient that here's a child, if you do this, this will happen. If you do this for your child, this will happen. The patient will invariably say, Dr. Saab, ye aapka bachcha hai, you do what you think is right. And this trust is that's one of the reasons why I think that being a doctor in India is the best job in the world. It's people, they trust you, and if you do a good job, they are always extraordinarily grateful. It's really wonderful, but I think it's terrible to betray that trust.
Yeah. And I'd like to say that I think this asymmetry of information, Pranay, that you've referred to is obviously a very powerful enabling factor, and in some sense it sort of shackles the legs of the prey, so that the prey really can't get away and is entirely helpless. I mean, how many times have you heard people say, well, of course you can't put a price on your health? So that is certainly an enabling factor. I do not think and I think the book is very clear that is not the cause, and the cause is much more the institutional setup that actually almost in this system, and I have to say in other systems around the world, but to a lesser extent, requires the doctor to actually be corrupt. I mean, where you have a system where there aren't enough government medical colleges, where you have to pay up to crores of rupees to get into a private medical college, you come out of university absolutely indebted in a system where the currency is one of kickbacks and excessive investigation and excessive treatment. You really have no choice at all but to be corrupt. So the preconditions are there, the enabling factors are there, and then the whole merry-go-round continues.
Vicious. Salman Khurshid, one of the things which Amartya Sen writes in his introduction is this whole issue of asymmetry. He also says it's an area where the media in India has not really done enough, has not highlighted it. In election campaigns, healthcare is hardly ever mentioned. And it goes back to his earlier theory of how famines ended, because the media started highlighting famines when people died, and governments respond to media. Why is healthcare not an election issue, not a media issue? And it's like, one of the things is, of course, and to be an election issue, one party should be seen better than the other party at improving things. If both are useless, it's not an election issue.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, healthcare is not entirely not an election issue. People are always demanding access to health, in the sense that if you want to win an election and you say, I'll bring a hospital here, whether it's in the private sector or it's in the voluntary sector, you get rewarded for it. People do respond to something like, I'll get hospital. But you mentioned about the media. I think there is lack of information in media and ability in the media to look at these issues. And it's not just in the media, it's also in the legal system. How many cases have you heard of where malpractice has had sanctions imposed on it? Judges are not familiar. Judges are not familiar with what it entails malpractice. I mean, you could have a death because of a cardiac attack because the patient was put through tests that were not advisable at that time. But in the routine that those tests would have been done, and the patient would collapse, and that's the end of the matter. And then all the hospital was do is to say, pay for the 3 years, the 3 days that you've been here, and we won't release the body unless you pay.
Yeah, so Dr. Paul, actually this is an important point, that the book shows that even where there has been clear cases of corruption and people have been convicted, I mean, hardly anybody gets convicted. And some, I think 2% get convicted, and even those carry on practicing. Why is that? Why isn't there not clear example, clear punishment? We do have Kunal here, who has been fighting an amazing battle, God bless you, and you have got compensation, and it is possible. Generally, doctors are not being punished.
But isn't that true for all forms of violations of law?
That's true, but that makes it okay?
No, that speaks of the legal system that we have. But I think the important part is the responsibility of the profession in this, which we must not forget. We must, as a profession, be responsible, we should be ethical, and I think our own self-regulation is so very important. And I think if there is a failure on our part, it is a failure of our collective will to maintain high ethos, high ethics, and high morality. And that's something which this country and all of us needed.
I'm sorry, Dr. Paul, but I don't think self-regulation has ever worked. I mean, not for the doctor's profession, not for any profession actually. And it is abysmal in terms of enforcement in our country that none of the doctors who Dr. Berger was talking about in the hysterectomy case, where you had hundreds and thousands of women whose uteruses were removed, though it was not required. And not a single doctor has lost his license, not a single doctor has gone to jail. And it's more than 5 years now since that case happened. So what can we expect from a system that does not find even that kind of criminal act to be something that should be punished immediately?
Well, that argument doesn't take away the fact that we must have our own system of regulation and standards, whether it is a profession like law or journalism. It stays there. I think the societal pressure on our accountability is the second layer through which we should all respond to these situations and to prevent this. There has to be a multi-layered response by the society as a whole, which includes the legal remedies, the societal pressure, the media pressure, as well as self-regulation and role models.